Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, ICL PERC Fire Webinar, PERC Introduction. Before we get started, I'd like to go over a few items so you know how to participate in today's event. If you prefer to join over the telephone, select the arrow next to the mute unmute icon on the bottom of the Zoom screen. Select Leave Computer Audio and then select Phone Call and follow the prompt to dial in. You will have the opportunity to submit questions to today's presenters by typing your questions into the questions pane of the control panel. You may send in your questions at any time during the presentation. We will collect these and address them during the Q&A session at the end of today's presentation. Today's webinar is being recorded and you will also be able to receive a copy of the PowerPoint presentation within 3 to 4 days. Thank you. And with that, I would like to welcome Paul Kovacs, the Executive Director of ICLR. Paul.
Thank you, Tracy. Welcome, everybody. The Institute's hosted probably more than 250 of these events, and I'm always excited when we do something that's very different, and today is definitely going to be different. We've got 4 speakers from 4 different parts of the world going to talk about the important hazard of wildfire and what we're learning from it. So this is a new global perspective on an important risk that we're dealing with. For those who are regulars, again, this is something new, so thank you for joining in, and I think this new approach that we're going to try today, I think you'll find it really intriguing. For those who are joining for the first time, welcome, and please stay with us. We do this monthly and deal with a number of issues. So for those who can join us next time, our very next session is Friday the 13th of December, and we're going to talk about asteroids striking the planet. So this is the Institute for Catastrophic Loss Reduction, and we're going to deal with a catastrophic presentation. And Professor Clark Chapman will be speaking on December 13th, and I hope you'll come back and join us for that. It should be a really interesting session. Anyway, I want to jump in. We have 4 speakers today. This is the first time we've ever had 4 speakers. Michael's up first. He's going to speak to you from Zurich. I'll be up second, speaking from the Toronto area. Then we have Rachel, who's going to speak about California risks. And then Adriana's calling in. It's Saturday for Adriana. She's calling in from Australia and talking about Australian risks. So you're going to get a truly global perspective on wildfire risk, looking across a number of different studies. Michael's up first because Zurich, he's been leading the flood resilience program at Zurich. And he's been doing leading a number of studies about flood and how we can learn across floods, how to understand and manage the risk better. And for the very first time, Michael approached Rachel and Adriana and myself and talked about, could this approach be applied to a different hazard, in this case, wildfire. But this idea of looking across hazards, what can we learn each time about the unique circumstances, but what are we accumulating in terms of understanding by looking across a number of different hazards in different places. It's been really exciting to work with Michael and his team and apply this approach that's been used many times and won a number of awards for the work on flood, but to try to apply that to a new hazard has been exciting for all of us. So Michael will be up first. I'm going to talk second about the fire in Fort McMurray. For those who are familiar with the fire in Fort McMurray, we'll come at it a little bit differently because we're using the approach set out by the Zurich study. So hopefully you might learn some new things about the fire that happened in Fort McMurray and what it meant. Rachel will be up next, and she'll talk about the fires in California and the remarkable destruction that's taking place. And Adriana will talk about some very large fires that have happened recently in Australia and Tasmania and help us understand that. So my job was to do a quick introduction. Welcome all of you before I turn it over to Michael. Thank you for calling in and joining us. I think this will be a really different session, and I hope you will really enjoy it. Remember that we have time for questions at the end. Send in your questions, save up your questions, and Glenn McGilvery will take us through that at the end. So hopefully we'll have half an hour for that. So with that quick introduction, I'm going to turn over to Michael, and Michael's joining us from Zurich. So it's well into the evening there. Michael, thank you for being here, and you're up.
Thank you very much, Paul. Good afternoon, everybody. It's a great pleasure to do the introduction here, but I really want to be quick and just provide a little bit of context while we're doing this type of forensic event analysis for natural hazards, and a little bit of the history where PERC is coming from. So as Paul was saying, this originally was invented for the peril of flooding. because since 2013, we have been running a non-profit flood resilience program, including an alliance, and that's where the methodology was originally used and developed. Next slide, please. So for the context, we started working as a alliance across different sectors, including research, the humanitarian and NGO sector, and Zurich representing the private sector in 2013. And our idea was really to find very applied ways how we can support communities in strengthening their resilience across a variety of countries and geographies around the world. So we're working in both developed and developing countries, but exclusively we've been working so far on the peril of flood. The one key point that I want to make is that we have really been thinking very deeply about the concept of resilience and what it means. And hence you see kind of a three-line definition here that I won't read out on the slide, but that effectively means for us that resilience is a concept that looks at risk management and development in a very integrated way, effectively meaning that it's not just about bouncing back to where you were or to be prepared for a hazard, but really trying to understand how you can get to the point where you bounce forward and achieve your objectives that you've had in the first place. So it's not about recovering from a disaster to the place where you were 5 years ago, but really making sure that you still are able to achieve your objectives. And this could be a family objective, a community level objective, or also a business objective. We've built our vision around this approach. And what we're trying to achieve is really support these communities in increasing their social, political, and financial investment, so that it doesn't become an either-or question, whether I protect what I already have and hence focus on risk management, or whether I invest my resources into development and hence moving forward, but not protecting that new development, but really making sure you do both at the same time in a reinforcing way. And that's really what the definition for us is of resilience. Next slide, please. The starting point is that we strongly believe in the prevention case, hence that whatever you can do up front to prevent an event from turning into a disaster rather than spend the money of just effectively cleaning up and deal with the consequences afterwards. For those that really go after the numbers games and focus on the economic case, the numbers are there. If you invest up from $1, then on average you can avoid the equivalent of $5 in future losses. So beyond all the humanitarian reasons why you should do and prevent, there's also an economic rationale behind this. So if you click once, exactly, thank you, then you see our motivations, hence why we want to do this shared approach and this nonprofit program. But you also have the references there where these numbers come from to make sure they are robust. And Paul, as we were discussing earlier, mentioned the IBHS Institute, and specifically for the American continent, there's a lot of research going on to validate those numbers that effectively, whatever you do, there is an economic case for investing in a pre-event resilience building. Next slide, please. So as part of the solutions and the tools in our toolbox, if you like, that we have developed over the years with the Alliance, there's one important piece that we have developed that we call the post-event review capability. And it's effectively the rear view mirror. It's the other side of our resilience building, in the sense that despite all the pre-event action that you can do, you still need to understand what is actually happening during and right after a disaster. So we've developed what we believe is a quite unique forensic methodology in the way we look at an event, and we try to learn from this event. And a couple of items are really important to keep in mind here. The first one is this term of unbiased. So we really come in as a third party that are neither having a stake in this particular event, nor with the stakeholders that typically are associated in a particular event or have been active in either preparing, managing the response, or then supporting the recovery from the disaster. So what we're doing is not a performance review or an analysis of how a specific actor was doing or not doing what they were supposed to do and hence cast blame, but come in with really an independent pair of eyes and just puzzle about the question. So why has this quite natural event as such turned into a humanitarian disaster? And that's the other point that I wanted to stress. I personally really dislike the term natural disaster because there's not much natural in the disaster. As I said, the event as such is natural, but then there's a lot of choice that we have how this then unfolds. And I think that's then the piece that is unnatural. And in fact, there's a book by the United Nations that looks exactly at this approach. And effectively what we want to do is overcome a little bit the fatalistic notion that what can you really do about it? It's natural, right? Well, there's a lot that we can do. And that's what we're trying to uncover. And in that sense, PERC is looking both at the things that we believe have not worked so well, but also then look at what has actually worked well, because very often that's often overlooked when you do a performance review and just, point the fingers at, oh, this went wrong and this derailed and this didn't quite work. But I think you can just as much learn from the positive things, especially for those that are maybe in another culture or in another geography. The best example are river levees, again, coming from the flood history. When an event is unfolding, you always ask the question, so how much of sandbags can we really stack on this to make it stronger? And by simply asking the question, so why sandbags, you found out that the answer was people were not knowing there's alternative solutions. And just by showcasing how alternative, better solutions to sandbags work, suddenly you're inspired and find out there's other alternatives. So it's also this positive attitude, in addition to finding out obviously what hasn't worked, that will lead to practical recommendations that we want to make. And this is not just for the future of the affected area, but I think we just as much need to ask ourselves the question, where is the next similar event going to happen? And what lessons can they learn beforehand? So where is the next Sandy? Where is the next Paradise fire? Where is the next Fort McMurray fire? And what could potentially those audiences learn? The PERC methodology is open source. You see the screenshot of the manual that we have written. So effectively anybody can take this away and apply the methodology on their own. But obviously it's great if we can collaborate on it and maybe know what the outcome was, so we can also, learn more and share further. Next slide, please. So just quickly to show that this is not done in isolation or without a kind of a global context, but quite specifically and literally the PERC is rooted in the Sendai Framework for Disaster Risk Reduction. So there's literally written in there that if you want to achieve the global goals of reducing disaster risk globally, then you have to share expertise and share knowledge, perform post-disaster reviews, and make sure there are lessons learned that people can take away to improve for the future. And that post-disaster reviews provide opportunities so you can, put this into practice and put this into policy as well. So that's the context, where we're doing this and why we're doing this. Next slide, please. So the purpose is really looking at the event level. So we also work across jurisdiction and kind of, administrative boundaries, because effectively natural events don't respect human boundaries. And as I said, it's not there to cast blame or look at how an individual actor has worked, but rather how the network functions and how agents, systems, and institutions either distract from or provide resilience across scales and across all those different institutions and actors that are involved. And we also try to do this across the time element of what we call the disaster risk management cycle. And in the end, it's really to make sure we share successes, we share lessons learned. And in that sense, the easiest way to approach a PERC is really ask simple questions as in, what have you learned? And then what were the surprising elements? And really take it from there. And that's where the forensic piece comes from. Next slide. So we've done about 13 post-flood studies so far across the globe. The good thing is that there's really a lot of commonalities falling out from these as well. So while every event is unique and has its particularities, there's always, a few confirming pieces of recommendations, of insights that you see across the board. And hence, that makes it even a stronger case to do these globally and compare and contrast. And this has also led to a series of, summary reports or medleys, as we call them, where we really want to highlight the, kind of almost the, most important lessons or the most common things that we see. And as Paul was saying, it's really exciting to see this spin out now to another peril. So while we believe certain aspects of what you look at and how you look at them are peril specific, the methodology is, I think, universally applicable to almost any type of hazard that can turn into a disaster. And it's really great to see that almost simultaneously we started doing 3 for wildfires in 3 different regions of the world. And I think that concludes the introduction, and I really want to make sure our main speakers can talk about what they actually have found in the 3 that we're going to turn to in just a minute. So thank you very much.
Alrighty, it's Paul. So let me jump in next. We're doing a quick world tour. So from Europe over to Canada, then we'll go down to California and Australia. So on the Canadian side, here's an image from the wildfire in 2016 in Fort McMurray, Alberta. Remarkable devastation experienced in Canada. And I'll take you a little bit through a story that I think several people on the line will know, but as Michael set up, we're going to look at it a little bit differently. The final report that we produced on this was released at the Risk Managers Conference in Edmonton back in September, and is available for anybody on the website, the ICLR website and the Zurich website. And it's a fairly detailed report. It's a fairly long report, so I'm just going to give you the highlights here today. But I hope that if you haven't seen it yet, you'll download it and read the full report. If we move to the next slide, please. The short story, this at the time in 2016 was the most damaging wildfire in the world. There had been no event anywhere in the world that had done the losses, the damage, the destruction that had taken place in Fort McMurray. It was absolutely remarkable event that's since been eclipsed by the fires in California, but billions and billions of dollars of damage. In Canada's 150-year history, these numbers were way bigger than anything we've seen before in terms of the values that were destroyed. Part of what we wrote up in the paper, in 2016, there were 2 crises that hit Fort McMurray. The fire was one. The other is the price of oil collapsed, and the repercussions of that are continuing. After the fire, we've been rebuilding and putting the community back, and the buildings are largely back and will be done soon. We reported on the current state of the reconstruction, but the price of oil has not come back, and the value of the reserves in the Fort McMurray area fell by trillions of dollars, not billions of dollars, and the drop in the price of oil led to a halt on exploration. There haven't been any new production facilities built. The action taking place has changed dramatically, and that's a change that is affecting the community today and will continue. So to have that happen virtually at the same time as the wildfire, there were 2 different events that affected this community in northern Alberta at the same time. If I can move to the next slide. Michael touched on the international framing for some of the work within Zurich, and some of the work within the Institute for Catastrophic Loss Reduction is largely taken from the global strategy, which is called the Sendai Framework for Disaster Risk Reduction. And the global strategy sets out 4 broad areas to work. So I'm going to use 4 slides to take you through each of the 4 to give you a quick summary of our report, but tie it back to this international framing. But I'll keep my comments here, very brief, so we can make sure we learn on and move forward and learn about California and Australia. So into the global strategy and the Canadian strategy for managing fires, earthquakes, floods, etc. The first and foremost priority is to understand the risk. How well do we understand, in this case, wildfire risk? So the research that we shared, this part of Alberta has fire regularly. The fire management process, the fire officials, etc. in the area, in our opinion, have a strong culture of learning. They often reflect on previous fires, what they could learn, what they could do about that, regularly reflect on past events and document what could have been done better and acted on it. So we felt that the agencies involved were familiar with the risk and showed a true understanding that they had learned from previous events like the Slave Lake Fire and others that had been in the area, and were constantly improving themselves. That's not meant to say everything was perfect, but this is a risk that is taken quite seriously by those who are required. One of the key findings, while there was remarkable destruction, more losses and damage than ever has been experienced from any event in Canadian history, 90% of the homes survived. And in part that was because things done in advance, in part that was done because of firefighters. There was a strong effort to protect the community and to respond to the fire. And despite the terrible destruction that could have been much worse, the processes did lead to save a lot of the structures in the community. And a strong reflection back on what needs to be done. Where we found the greatest weakness in terms of understanding the risk, it was not the firefighters, it was not the officials, it was getting back to the individual property owner level. There was an awareness of fire because there's fire regularly across Canada, but in particular in that part of Canada. But truly getting down to the property owner level and understanding the risk was not at the level that I think it should have been. And Canada's national program to deal with that is called Fire Smart, and to try to ensure that more Canadians living at risk, more people in Fort McMurray, but more people across Canada who live at risk of wildfire are more aware of what it's like to live with fire and understand. And in particular, we're keen on the program Fire Smart as the most effective way to understand that. So we did see an opportunity to do better, but in terms of understanding the risk, some of the key officials re-demonstrated to us they knew what they were doing. They have the right kind of process to get better and better at it. We found some things that were identified in the post-event evaluation, but generally the process worked well. The opportunity to do better is to focus on property owners. If I can move to the next slide. The second of the four basic action priorities under the Sendai Framework for Disaster Risk Reduction focuses on governance. This fire, large events, are very complicated. There were a lot of people involved, a lot of agencies, a lot of people in the private sector like insurance companies, the Red Cross. There was a long group of people. It was a very complicated event. The bigger the event, the more complicated they seemed to get. Alberta had some recent experience, so with the Slave Lake wildfire, perhaps even more so with the flooding in Calgary that had happened 3 years before. Some of this coordination across organizations, there was some experience with the process and with the recovery process. We still found that it was generally improvised, and it did a pretty good job of improvising, but it wasn't pre-planned. And the risk will continue. There's no question there'll be more fires in the area. So we thought that the opportunity going forward is to sort of formalize this process and to have the different participants in Northern Alberta, but I think this could be duplicated in other jurisdictions with wildfire risk, forming some established organization. We were proposing a wildfire fire resilience advisory committee, but some sort of forum where these organizations are talking regularly. And then when the fire happens, you all know each other and you're ready to go. And talking regularly so their plans. So again, our review on the governance side, we didn't see many things fall between the cracks. We didn't see a lot of mistakes go on, but they were kind of made up on the go. And it was our advice there was a chance to more formalize that going forward. If I move to the next slide. The third big global strategy is get on with investing in risk reduction. Michael talked about you spend $1, you save $5, or you save a lot of money if you get in front of all of this. That's we found a lot of evidence in Canada and in the Fort McMurray area of where risk reduction had been done, and it helped and it mattered. It made a difference. For example, the highway that connects Fort McMurray down to Edmonton had just been twinned. It just had been opened again with a greater capacity. And if it hadn't happened, all those people wouldn't have been able to get away from the fire. But we're still frustrated. There's only one road in and out of Fort McMurray, and having a second road, get on with putting in a second road will be a good thing. One of the areas that stood out to us when we did the evaluation, the fire threatened the people in Fort McMurray, but it also threatened very large facilities, oil production facilities in the area. And largely, they held up very well because they took this threat very seriously. They spent money on risk reduction. They prepared their facilities. And they did have to shut down because they had no workers, but they didn't really experience damage because they had planned and prepared for it. There's lots of evidence from this fire and from other events that investing in resilience really works, and many investments had been made, but we should have done more. That's why we had these big losses, that there was definitely the opportunity to have gone further and done more. If I move to the next slide. So this is the last of my slides. When the fire occurred in Fort McMurray Wood Buffalo, the conversation immediately, the moment as the fire was being extinguished, started to talk about how to put the community back together, how to do it properly, how to do investments in the community so the community would be more resilient in the future. It was a very healthy, positive conversation. Part of that conversation said we should spend a little bit longer to make sure we do it right. I know why everybody wanted to hurry, but there was a deliberate conversation, setting out goals and setting out the time required to achieve those goals, and including the community in that conversation. One of the ones that was handled, although some of us would have handled it slightly differently, was some of the homes that were destroyed were in areas exposed to flooding. And one of the options could have been to not rebuild in those areas. That wasn't the choice made, but at least it was considered. It was an active conversation going on. Should we rebuild in those zones? And the decision made was we will rebuild, but we will commit to protecting those buildings. We'll put in place the defenses and the structures so that these homes eventually will, or these properties will not be at risk of flooding. And so that was a conversation. It was an active conversation about how to make the community better, not just immediately put things back quickly. We documented how the Red Cross played a remarkable role. We think the activities of Red Cross in Fort McMurray were as great as all the other events they've dealt with over the last 150 years or so. The Red Cross played a very big role and moved beyond some of the traditional things that they've done for a long period of time and got very involved in the recovery process with a lot of new funding. We also highlighted the role of insurance. If someone has an old home that is insured and it is destroyed by a fire, the insurers put back a similar home, but a home that is new. And we saw evidence that the homes put back by insurance companies, a new home is more resilient than an older home. Current codes and rules and requirements require a number of things. There was an opportunity to go a little bit further and add some other features, but the ones that were put in place by insurance companies to follow the rules and follow the process did contribute to having a community that's more resilient today than the homes that were destroyed before. We think the big opportunity here is that there is not a formal plan for Fort McMurray or for other communities in Alberta and British Columbia and some of the areas at risk, Northern Ontario, to have a pre-hazard recovery plan. And we think that that's a mindset and approach that would be very good for communities and for provincial and even the federal government to have in place. Have a recovery plan before these events occur. Think about what actions could be done so the community could be put back, but not put back the way it was because it had a bad experience. It's not the ideal circumstance. Can we put back the community and put it back better than it was before? So the quick comment from us, it was really exciting to look at Fort McMurray from a different lens. We saw a lot of positives that happened in Fort McMurray. You can't look at the worst loss in Canadian history and not find some weaknesses and problems, so we documented some of those. And we did see 4 broad opportunities to implement some of this new national framing or international framing about how to deal with fires in the future. It is possible to do better going in the future if we choose to. But by and large, Fort McMurray was a big loss that was handled fairly well, but there's scope to do better in the future. And so with that, I'm going to turn it over to Rachel, and Rachel will take us on the next step around the world and talk about California.
Thanks, Paul. Hi, everyone. Good afternoon. So I am Rachel Norton, and I work for the Institute for Social and Environmental Transition International. And we are a member of the Zurich Flood Resilience Alliance, which Michael talked about in his introduction. And so today I will be talking with you about our recent report on the 2017 and 2018 California wildfires, which was the result of a collaboration with ISET International, Zurich Insurance, as well as DuPont. And our report, which will be published in January of 2020, goes into very specific detail about what happened, what lessons were learned, and where opportunities exist for building wildfire resilience in California and in other fire-prone places. And we specifically look at the Tubbs and Thomas fires, which occurred in 2017, and at the Camp and Woolsey fires, which occurred in 2018. And while I can't go into all the details, hopefully you'll read our report if you're interested in learning a little bit more about that. I will talk today about why we decided to study these wildfires. And I'll also provide an overview of some of our key insights and the recommendations that we developed. And a lot of those will actually echo some of the points that Paul mentioned in his presentation as well. So next slide, please. So why these fires? And I think as we've all heard, and as Paul mentioned, you know, the Camp Fire was just, the extent of the damage and destruction was amazing to hear about, and amazing not in a good way, obviously. The Camp Fire did surpass the Fort McMurray fire in terms of being the most expensive disaster at that point globally, wildfire. And at the time, 2017 was the most destructive wildfire season on record. There were over 9,500 fires, and they burned close to 1.3 million acres of land. That year also brought 5 of the 20 most destructive wildfires in California's history, of which the Tubbs and Thomas fires were 2 of those. And then a year later, the 2018 wildfire season actually surpassed that devastation in 2017, and it became the deadliest and most destructive wildfire season that was ever recorded in California. So just to go a little bit more into detail about the specifics of the fires, the Thomas Fire, which occurred in 2017 near the town of Montecito, contributed to debris flows after the fires that killed 23 people. The Tubbs Fire, which occurred in 2017 as well near the city of Santa Rosa, led to an urban conflagration that destroyed thousands of homes and killed 22 people. The Camp Fire in 2018 nearly wiped the town of Paradise off the map. It killed at least 85 people and burned 95% of homes and businesses in that town. And at the same time in 2018, the Woolsey Fire destroyed over 1,600 structures, many of which were very high-priced homes, causing an estimated $4 billion to $6 billion in damage. Next slide, please. So based on this study and our findings, we've developed several key insights and recommendations that I'm going to share with you today, some of which point to what Michael mentioned, you know, why these events really turn into humanitarian disasters. But I'd also like to reiterate that, you know, these findings and insights are really based on the knowledge of the people that we talked with for this report. And so, you know, whether we basically repackaged them and brought them together so that they can apply to California, but also to other communities that are faced with similar challenges. So these insights include that, similar to what Paul mentioned, while Californians are very aware of the wildfire danger in their state, and the 2017 and 2018 wildfire seasons made this very apparent. But awareness of this risk isn't necessarily translating to risk-reducing action very quickly. And there could be a number of reasons for this, including the cost of retrofits, building to code, the aesthetic appeal of maintaining vegetation close to homes, and the perception that the recent fires were somewhat exceptional. And this may also be because fire severity is difficult to predict and assess, and this can also complicate planning and response. Because wildfire behavior is dependent on interactions between weather, fuel, and local topography, predicting the severity of a fire before it happens or as it is occurring is pretty much impossible. As a result, it's really hard to help communities to assess how to recover and prepare for future events. And along those same lines, we found that more data and information are needed on how all the different elements of mitigation interact during a fire and which elements might be more cost-effective than others. This is particularly true as the state considers how to address their need for low-cost fire-resistant retrofits. We also found that the social and economic costs of a wildfire far exceed its direct impacts, as they have cascading effects on local and regional economies, as well as on housing and labor markets. And as Paul mentioned a little bit as well, we found that we really don't prepare people for what happens after a fire's aftermath. Disaster preparedness programs do a great job at educating communities on what to do before and during a fire, but a gap persists in really preparing people for what they do after a fire happens and during the recovery. And we found that ensuring adequate insurance is complex. The wildfires that we studied pointed to gaps in insurance in terms of coverage, awareness, and communication. And it really highlighted the need for ongoing collaboration and due diligence to balance risk, insurance requirements, and insurability in ways that are going to work for everybody involved. And in California, we found that despite fires, development is continuing in the wildland-urban interface. This development is driven by population growth and housing demand, and it's continuing despite the hazards, the known hazards that fires pose. So we should, really consider either limiting development in these areas or where that should really be, avoided because the hazard is too high or the egress is too limited. Or we should really think about how we build in these areas, in these high hazard areas. And then ultimately we found that responsibility for reducing risk in the WUI is shared. And this requires coordinated community-wide engagement to deal with this risk. Next slide, please. So based on these insights, we came up with several broad but hopefully actionable recommendations that cover a range of initiatives or actions that can be taken at different levels. And I want to emphasize what Michael talked about or mentioned in his slides as well, that these should be, we hope that these are practical recommendations that apply not just to the impacted area, but for states and other areas that are looking at these events and are thinking about if the next fire is going to happen to them. So Chapter 7A of the California Building Code is an excellent first step in helping communities in the wildland-urban interface to reduce their vulnerability. And given that these codes can be done at little to no additional cost, we recommend that they be applied and or required much more broadly. We also recommend incentivizing smart growth, particularly in the WUI, as this is the fastest area of development in the United States. As a result, this will result in increased wildfire risk unless it really is informed by these past events. And local governments can address this growth management through a number of tools, some of which are listed on this graphic in the slide here. And this graphic is provided by Headwaters Economics. So as you can see, it includes landscaping regulations, forest management projects, land use and development codes, so a whole host of actions that communities can take to develop and follow kind of a more smart growth pathway. And because conditions on one property can either reduce or increase the fire risk of nearby properties, property maintenance in the WUI should be considered a social responsibility. And this can ideally be implemented through community networks, homeowners associations, and through coordinated government action and via other stakeholders. And then again, echoing what Paul talked about, we recommend that communities plan for recovery and not just for preparing for a fire or for during the evacuation. Local and county governments can do this through institutionalizing recovery, through developing and practicing recovery plans, and really building in the capacity of staff to carry out tasks during the recovery. And key stakeholders, that are in charge of vital infrastructure before an event happens should really consider the unthinkable in how they can protect infrastructure and facilitate a smoother recovery. Just thinking, about how these systems can fail and what actions can be taken in advance of an event and during the reconstruction to increase the robustness and redundancy in these areas. And again, echoing what Michael said, wildfires do not respect jurisdictional boundaries. So preparing for them, responding to them, and recovering from them shouldn't either. So with this in mind, neighboring local, county, and state governments should collaborate and prepare together, both for the response to a wildfire and for the potential cascading impacts that result from related natural hazards, such as landslides or floods, for example, as well as for infrastructure failure and for disaster refugees. And ultimately, other wildfire-prone states and other communities should learn from what California has been going through for the past several years and what actions they've taken to reduce their risk. They should look at California's examples and adapt them to their context and improve on them if and where possible. For example, California's wildfire hazard zone mapping and their Chapter 7A building codes are really strong initial steps that other states can replicate. Next slide, please. So to conclude, ultimately, we know that fire risk is increasing due to a variety of factors, some of which we can control, namely where we build and how we build. And notwithstanding the role of climate in contributing to our fire risk, i.e. there are changes in the timing of fall winds relative to fall rains, and we're seeing hotter and drier summers. And all of these are increasing the potential for wildfire ignition in California. So notwithstanding this climate element, we really need to realize that there are actions that are in our control and that we can implement to reduce our overall exposure. We just really need to be much more proactive about doing so. And ultimately, communities around the world really that are in wildfire hazard areas should really begin thinking through in detail what the reality of a wildfire event is going to look like in their community and what they can do between now and that next fire to increase their resilience. And while communities can rely on practices that have served to reduce their risk in the past, ultimately we're going to need new models or structures and actions that go beyond it and expand on these practices and that really shift how we are building our resilience to wildfires, both of the present and the future. And so to conclude, we really need to go beyond just merely acknowledging this new reality of wildfire hazard that's in California and occurring in communities around the world and move to action. And with that, I will pass it to Adriana.
Thank you, Rachel. And thanks very much, everybody, for having me. I'm Adriana Keating of the International Institute for Applied Systems Analysis in Austria and also RMIT University here in Melbourne in Australia. And today I'll be speaking about the PERC on the wildfires in Tasmania in January this year. So funding for this PERC came from EASA via the Zurich Flood Resilience Alliance and RMIT University here in Melbourne via my colleague John Hanma, who did the field work with me. And we also have support from Zurich, Australia.
And the study is currently being drafted, and we hope to publish early next year, realistically. As you may have heard on the news, we're currently in the grip of an early and devastating fire season, and that's something we'll need to think about in terms of publication timing. Okay, next slide, please. The summer of 2018-2019 was a pretty devastating fire season for the state of Tasmania. And just a reminder, Tassie is the small island off the southeast coast of Australia. And just a point on terminology there, we refer to wildfire as bushfire. And most Australians, including myself, are largely incapable of not shortening names, so Tasmania is Tassie. So being so far south, Tassie has a pretty cool climate, and while it does have a history of some pretty bad bushfires, the weather conditions that led to this one were unprecedented. Starting in late December, the fire services were overwhelmed by multiple large fires that burned over 200,000 hectares across the western half of the island for over a month. 2,500 lightning strikes led to 70 ignitions, which joined to form 4 large fire complexes. And you can see the dark green ones on the map there, and I've circled the one that we're going to focus on. So this PERC focuses largely on the Riveau Road complex fire, because this is the one that threatened settlements and prompted an evacuation. The PERC focuses on community and business resilience rather than the firefighting response operations so much. And this is for 2 reasons. Firstly, we interviewed quite widely, and community and business resilience were the areas that people felt needed to be talked about. And secondly, because the National Council for Fire Agencies conducted an in-depth review of the response operations. There have been a number of reviews done in Australia, and they all tend to focus on response operations, but almost none on the wider issue of community resilience. So this PERC starts to fill that gap. Thankfully, there was no direct loss of life, although there were some injuries. Only a handful of buildings were lost. However, there was significant losses of forestry resources, and the fire burnt through the Tasmanian Wilderness World Heritage Area, or the TWA, as they call it. The cornerstone of the Tasmanian tourism industry was the Tahoon Airwalk, where visitors can walk through the forest canopy, and this was destroyed by the fires. And this, along with the loss of the forest and the general disruption of the event, led to significant impacts on the tourism industry. I mentioned that there was no direct loss of life, but a leading smoke epidemiologist based in Tassie has argued that there's almost certainly been deaths from the smoke. In fact, several towns were ordered to evacuate on the basis of air quality rather than the direct fire threat, which has never happened before in Australia. And smoke has also impacted Tassie's growing viticulture industry. If there are any wine drinkers listening in, you might be familiar with the Browns Brothers wineries, who about a decade ago brought up large tracts of land in Tassie on the basis that it would be ideal for vineyards under climate change. But now there's these increasing bushfires and the smoke, and that's thrown a bit of a spanner into the works of that climate change adaptation. Okay, next slide, please. And this is the TWA. As you can see, it makes up a huge portion of the state. The region is globally significant. It covers more than 1 million hectares and is one of the most significant regions of temperate rainforest in the world. It has one of the last stands of Gondwanan vegetation in the world, which is not fire adapted, and there's evidence that Indigenous people lived in the area for more than 20,000 years before colonisation. So there's huge cultural heritage there as well. Next slide. The graph on the left here shows the 50-year history of fire in the TWA with a clear upward trend, particularly since about the year 2000. And this trend applies right across the state. Prior to 2000, fires in Tasmania were caused by arson and accidents, but now they're caused by dry lightning. So there's this massive shift that's having to occur amongst the fire agencies. Climate change has arrived in Tasmania, and it's created a completely new fire regime. The last few years have seen record low rainfall and record heat, creating a huge amount of fuel, and this fuel is then ignited by these dry lightning strikes. Now, whether the dry lightning strikes are increasing due to climate change or not, or whether we're just getting better at detecting them, is still up for the debate. But in January this year, about 2,500 lightning strikes hit the state. They created little ignition sites that smoulder, particularly in the fire-loving button grass. And then a few days later, when the weather conditions come along that are right for fire, the whole place just explodes. And the fire services were not equipped to deal with this new fire regime. Firefighters told us that even with thousands of men and equipment and air bombers, they still couldn't jump on these fires quick enough to stop them from spreading. The Trois is extraordinarily rugged and wild terrain. The canopy is so dense that you can't drop firefighters or water in directly. They have to be dropped in sometimes kilometres away, and then they have to hike over to the fire. Next slide, please. So we identified key insights in 5 areas. I've already spoken about the impact of climate change and the new fire regime, so I want to jump right into risk reduction. In Tasmania, as in most of Australia, bushfire risk reduction pretty much consists of prescribed burning programs. Now, there are challenges with this program in regards to different land tenures, particularly objections to burning on private land, and conversely calls for more freedom for landowners to conduct burns. And there's also diverse views about the effectiveness of prescribed burning, but overall we found that the program works pretty well. The issue with prescribed burning is that it can lull people into a false sense of security. So this was burnt last year, so we're safe, when in actual fact it needs to be complemented with other strategies, such as physical removal of fuel and both green and grey fire breaks. And climate change is reducing the window available for conducting prescribed burns. Also, the more extreme fire weather means that higher winds and more damage from ember attack, which can't be mitigated by the removal of ground fuel. Turning now to the evacuation, the Riveau Road fire and associated smoke prompted the evacuation of a number of towns and hamlets. A lot of people went to stay with friends and family, but some had no option but to stay in an evacuation centre. And the evacuation centre was operational for 3 weeks, which is way longer than they had envisaged and is really healthy. And at its peak, it housed 700 people plus 100 pets. Another 400 animals and 59 people were accommodated at an animal refuge down the road. Now, the evacuation centre was funded and run by a municipal council called the Huon Valley Council, with the support of community sector organisations. So the Salvation Army provided 10,000 meals, the Red Cross was there, as well as a few others. And the disaster planning done by the council was fantastic, and the evacuation centre ran pretty well. This is a good practice example that others can learn from. After the event, though, a number of issues emerged around cost recovery for the community sector organisations. So these organisations don't have funds in their general pool to cover emergency events. And the councils are also cash strapped. They have very limited funds. So because of the size of this event, the council is technically able to claim 75% of costs from the state government, who in turn can claim it from the federal government. So there's this big bureaucratic, slow-moving process here. And so while things worked pretty well during the event, afterwards there was confusion and very strained relationships over cost recovery, so much so that some of the NGOs are questioning whether they can be available to respond in emergencies if they can't guarantee cost recovery. Now, this is really devastating and a really, really scary prospect, because the councils don't have the resources to do the response on their own. They need the NGOs. The issue of warnings also came up during our investigation. So while things worked pretty well, there were issues in regards to tourists who didn't receive the warnings because they weren't monitoring traditional channels. They didn't have mobile phones, they might not speak English. And also the warning structure has been designed for much shorter events. So what happened here was that some warnings were in place for days and days, which caused a lot of confusion and complacency and frustration amongst the population. Now, earlier I touched on the issue of smoke impacts, and this was raised as an emerging issue in wildfire research internationally. Not only the impacts from smoke from bushfires, but also the impacts of smoke from prescribed burning. So the risk reduction actually creates a risk to health. And the population in southwest Tassie is particularly vulnerable, being poorer, older and sicker than other parts of the country. And finally, we gained some insights on the role of research and science in disaster risk management for this event. And this focus came from the RMIT funders of the study. This was their interest. And I think it shows how the PERC methodology can be adapted to different needs. What we found here is that research and science plays a significant role within state-level agencies, a bit of a mixed role amongst NGOs, and is not drawn on locally in any direct way. And there's some really interesting research going on regarding mitigating the impacts of smoke on wine grapes, things you can spray on the wine grapes, early warning systems for that, and also marketing research to help the tourism industry recover. Okay, next slide, please. And we're still finalising the list of recommendations, but we're looking at about 10 as this list shows. The first one is that good practice example that others can learn from in regards to the planning done by the Municipal Council for the evacuation centre and the animal refuge. This then flows on to the second recommendation, which is about the need for clear pre-arranged agreements between councils and community sector organisations about expectations of service during delivery, during events, and cost recovery afterwards. The next recommendation is about improving communication about the provision of community and business recovery grants, which I haven't touched on here yet. In disaster events in Australia, state governments usually provide recovery grants for affected community members and businesses, and in this case there was significant confusion and quite a lot of anger about eligibility for these grants and how to claim them. In regards to risk reduction, the Tasmania Fire Service has a great bushfire ready neighbourhoods program that we think could be extended. It goes a little bit beyond prescribed burning to starting to look at community preparedness. Our findings about the impacts of smoke naturally lead to a recommendation for further research on this for both human health and for vineyards. And the people we spoke to in the tourism apiary, that's honey, and wine industries frankly seemed a little blindsided by these events, and these businesses we think could benefit from some industry-based adaptation planning, potentially supported by government, considering the significance for the growing tourism and wine industries to the Tasmanian economy. The impacts of the fires on the Twa indicates a real need for multi-stakeholder engagement about what's worth protecting in a bushfire event. The sad reality is that it won't be possible to protect everything, so assets are going to have to be prioritised. Protecting human life should remain the top priority, but beyond that, it's a case of negotiating values. Perhaps protecting a 1,000-year-old stand of ancient... So there's a bit of noise on the call. I'm not sure if somebody's come off mute. Perhaps protecting a 1,000-year stand of ancient billy pine is more important than a bridge that can actually be rebuilt with insurance. These are the conversations that Tasmanians need to start having. In relation to this, though, one thing we found was that that was a little surprising was a huge amount of mutual respect between the conservationists, or greenies, as we like to call them, and the fire services. So Tasmania is a very conservative state and has a history of a huge tension between those dependent on the forestry industry and environmentalists. And yet we found this mutual respect. So there used to be established working relationships between these groups, but these have fallen away in recent years. So our recommendation here is that these be re-established with the confidence that there really is good faith on both sides. And finally, we have a recommendation about lessons learned. There have been a number of previous devastating bushfires and then operational reviews. And the fire services are still reporting against recommendations made into the 2013 fires, the 2016 fires, now they've got the 2019 fires, and the way this season's going, they'll probably have the 2020 fires. And while the government endorses and agrees to these recommendations, no extra funding is provided for the fire agencies to implement changes. So that's where our recommendation comes in this regard. And I'll stop there. Thanks for your attention, and I really look forward to the discussion. Thank you.
Hello, everybody. This is Glenn McGilvery, Managing Director of the Institute for Catastrophic Loss Reduction. It's now my job to push along a Q&A discussion and a discussion. We got only a couple of questions from attendees. I'm going to start with those questions. So first of all, we have one question, and I think I'm going to first direct this at Paul, because Paul, you talked about the oil sands facilities. Then we can open it up to the others. So the question is, in the Fort McMurray fire, the costs and impacts were not equally shared by the stakeholders in the region. For example, the operators of the major oil and gas companies in the region, who are responsible for half of the emissions of the entire province, were the least financially impacted compared to the communities. How can a new resilient system of prevention ensure that not only the physical risks to the oil and gas industry are considered, or how can a new resilient system ensure that not just the physical risks to the oil and gas assets are considered, but also that, I guess, these operations contribute to, I guess, resilience of the whole community? Paul?
Thank you, Glenn. Thank you for the question. So the system that we have in Canada, and I think it's fairly common around the world, there's a very high expectation that property owners take care of themselves. And within that context, we found that in the community of Fort McMurray, there were some homeowners and some businesses that did a really good job, and some homeowners and businesses that didn't do as good a job. One of the groups just outside of Fort McMurray, the companies with very large investments in oil sands, are a group of companies that worked really hard to manage their resilience to fire. They took the risk extremely seriously. They took a number of steps to protect their facilities. They spent their own money in advance, and the firefighters did not have to spend a lot of time protecting directly protecting the oil facilities, because they were so busy and so needed in the community where less had taken place. But there was a very large effort made by the owners of the major oil facilities, and the actions they took were very effective. So for me, that was a strong indication that if you do work hard to protect yourself, there are actions that can be taken, can make a big difference. You don't have to count entirely on firefighters to stop the fire from damaging your property. The whole system for paying for this, protecting property is generally seen as the responsibility of the property owner themselves. And I think a common message across all of these hazards, once fire gets in the community, it can spread. And if you have some who are not taking care of their property, it is bringing a threat to others. These are the sorts of conditions where you talk about the broad societal needs to promote resilience, and why many of us have been championing the idea that governments and broader agencies play a bigger role, which in part they do through building codes, in part they do through local planning regulations, but to have a stronger commitment for some of the community actions to build resilience and not leave as much of the responsibility always back with individual property owners is a good opportunity for further success. So embracing that responsibility is critical. I think the question also came back to now who pays. If you do have these broader expectations of society to deal with resilience, how do you pay for that? And those are even more complicated questions. But anyway, I did want to share part of what we learned in Fort McMurray. We did see some who took protection of their own property very seriously. Some of the ones that really stood out were some of those with large investments in the oil facilities. They worked really hard to protect themselves, and it was effective. And so if you do take the steps, I think the savings are much greater than the cost. I hope that was helpful for the person asking the question.
Thanks, Paul. For this next question, I'm going to direct it at Michael. And Michael, you did answer this online, but if you could share your answer with the group, that would be appreciated. So the question is, In looking at the Zurich methodologies and concepts, how do you see the discipline of business continuity fitting into your resilience concept? Also, how do you see your methodology fitting into the 5 or 4 pillars of classic disaster management methodology? Finally, are you partnering with Public Safety Canada as well as private disaster resilience groups such as CRHnet in Canada? Michael?
Sure, thank you for that question. So as I tried to mention with our introduction and the definition of resilience, for us, resilience is really a multifaceted concept that is not just looking at one element or one direction. So for example, we're not just looking at physical aspects, and we're not just looking at preparedness in terms of the time series or how you sequentially do certain steps in the disaster risk management cycle either. So the concept that we have developed in terms of measuring and really, unfolding resilience is what we call the resilience measurement framework for communities. Now, we have done this specifically for flooding thus far, but again, like PERC, we believe the methodology is equally applicable to other perils as well. So if you look for the flood resilience measurement framework for communities, or the FRMC for short, again, this is open source, and you'll see, the full depth and richness of how we look at resilience. So specifically in terms of business continuity, if we take the lens or, one direction of looking at resilience of the capitals approach, which by the way goes back to the Sustainable Livelihood Framework, or the SLF, that originally was built for the development sector. So if you look at the capitals, then there's 5 elements of capitals that are equally important. So beyond the very traditional physical capital, there's social, human, natural, and specifically financial capital as well. So the business resilience part would sit in the financial capital. And there's various ways how you can build business resilience. Obviously, you can purchase insurance. You can look at other ways to protect your financial assets, be it through a disaster fund or other means. But clearly, business continuity planning and an awareness for the risk that you have play a role there as well. And that would be considered in the financial capital of one direction of looking at resilience. Now, for the second part of the question, in terms of disaster risk management, and for us, it's really important that we look at disaster risk management rather than just managing the disaster once it's happened. So again, it's kind of this timing element that is key. So for us, the disaster risk management cycle is an iterative approach of, when do you need to do what? And clearly the most prominent ones are preparedness, in the sense of doing this very early, as you're expecting a disaster to unfold. You then have the response phase, and then you try to recover as quickly as you can. But there's 2 risk reduction elements in that disaster risk management cycle as well. There's corrective risk reduction. So as your exposure, as your assets are already there, what can you do to improve that risk? But then equally important, if not more important, is the prospective aspect. So prospective risk reduction tries to avoid the creation of new risks, be it land zoning, be it building codes, making sure that new risk is not exposed to the hazard that you're looking at. So in that sense, you have your 5 time steps of looking at resilience through the disaster risk management cycle as well. And I think particularly the disaster risk management cycle is very helpful for the PERC methodology to structure your recommendations, because it's typically one element of that time step, one element of those time series, one step that is taken by a specific sector or group of sectors. So the response organizations, the recovery, the volunteering, the NGO organizations, and then, kind of the governance approach of how you look at correcting existing risk or protecting the creation of new risk. So I hope that is helpful as an answer.
Thank you, Michael. That's appreciated. I think I'm going to direct this next question to Rachel. So Rachel, I think California in many ways is seen as a leader in some of the wildfire kind of risk management and measurement areas. You've talked a little bit about the California Wildfire Building Code. You talked a little bit about the risk maps in California. And I was wondering if you can relate to us maybe some of the strong points and some of the flaws in those two things. I'm thinking, you know, for example, Santa Rosa in 2017, Santa Rosa, the fire there was fairly deep into the urban core. The carriage of embers was quite far into the center, and that part of Santa Rosa was actually in a low risk area according to the risk maps of that county. So what are some of the strong points and some of the weak points for those, at least the Wildfire Building Code and the risk maps in California?
Sure, thanks for that question. And I think you answered part of it. It is that while the mapping is helpful for identifying those communities and homes that are in high hazard and very high hazard areas where the code is required, they are often and can be, you know, in pretty close proximity to areas where the code is not required. And as I mentioned in my presentation, and I think Paul talked about as well, you know, what one person does to their home or what one community does to reduce their risk can influence their neighbor's risk. So I think where you have areas that require the code and others where the code is not required, that's where you get kind of variability in what people are doing to reduce their risk, and which changes the risk scenario in general for people. And I think another aspect of the mapping as well that makes it less of a strong tool, even though it is still very effective, is what you talked about, Glenn, is that a lot of these fires that we saw and that we studied were very wind driven, and that can push embers, you know, miles in front of the fire front, and can, you know, ignite, land on homes that are not up, that have not been built to code or haven't, you know, taken actions to reduce their risk. So in that regard, you know, the mapping is a strong tool for new home, or the mapping in conjunction with the code is a strong tool for new homes, but there are those areas of risk that, you know, I've talked about and that you mentioned, where when you're looking at it on a broader basis and on, you know, as we talked about, wildfires don't follow these jurisdictional rules, and they don't follow maps, and that's where I think you can see these tools being not quite as effective.
Great, thank you. I think this next question I'm going to direct to first to Adrienne and then to Michael. So post-event reviews, how can they be beneficial and how can they be limiting? What are the strong points of them and what are the weak points of looking at an event afterward and doing these reviews? Adriana?
Thanks. No, I'm going to need a moment to consider that question, and so I'm going to flick it over to Michael, who's been involved with a lot more of them than me.
Well, thanks for putting me on the spot, Adriana. Not sure I have the perfect question. I don't think we have a Q&A section in the PERC manual that quite addresses this. So I think the strength of the PERC methodology is, you know, really the idea that you come in with an unbiased view. So first of all, because we are typically outsiders that, of course, then do a lot of background research before we go in and really ask the obvious questions, but rather, you know, start with ideas of what is worthwhile pursuing. And by the way, that's where I think the forensics comes from, in the sense that it is really detective work. You see the end result and you try to work backwards what led to the result that you're seeing and what leads can you pursue. But in that sense, you really need to come in with an open mind, and any information, any puzzle piece that you're getting by your interviewees will then lead on to the next set of questions that you can ask, and will let you dig deeper and really start getting the full picture. So I think that's one of the big strengths, that, you know, there's not a particular mandate that we have to fulfill. And also while we try to always have this positive tone, we're not forced to really please anyone in a particular way either. So there's no expected result or kind of a preempted result that we need to find, but we can really work independently. I think the other aspect of that also is that because we're not trying to cast blame or find out now who's at fault and then who did wrong, what we're really trying to do with the way we ask the questions and the way we proceed in these semi-structured interviews is to build the trust of the respondents and really highlight that we are able to transport a message that they want to make. So clearly, once all the puzzle pieces are on the table, we're trying to, put them together and provide that composite view. But we're really steered by the knowledge and the insights that our interviewees give to us. And that also helps in the sense that very often people are able to tell us stories that wouldn't come out otherwise, or sometimes that they feel they wouldn't be able to tell, especially when they are named individuals. And in the PERC, they are not, unless they specifically want to be. So PERCs try to be anonymous and not putting individuals on the spotlight. So to the extent that they can really tell a message that they always wanted to tell, but sometimes it's not that easy to go to your boss and say, well, it's the lack of funding or it's the lack of procedures or whatever it may be. And in that sense, we are really transporting their message. They're sometimes in a position to then take the report and say, hey, look, somebody is saying this and I would really support this, where in fact it's really speaking them through us. In terms of the downside of these PERC studies, I think it is resource intensive. So you need to come in and have a funder or somebody who has the capacity to support these projects. And the other aspect of the semi-structured approach and working by hypothesis is that you never really complete. So I think the question to ask here is, when is good enough, the moment when you can stop your investigations. Typically you find this in the time frame when answers seem to be, coming back to us and start being repetitive. So once you seem to get the same information and the same pictures painted by different stakeholders, I think that's where you can reasonably assume you're getting a somewhat complete picture. But clearly you could go on asking questions and talking to stakeholders for a very long time. And I think there you just need to find the right balance and trade-off and say, okay, this is, I think, where we have to stop it. Adriana?
Yes, thanks, Michael. And I've had a few thoughts as you've been speaking as well. The independence, as Michael said, is a key thing here. The no blame approach. So I was recently involved in writing a best practice handbook for lessons learned after disaster events, and the approach that the expert working group put into this handbook really is a reflection of the PERC methodology, or the PERC methodology really ticks all these boxes that a no blame, that a best practice lessons learned report should be doing. And in particular in Australia, we have a history of what's called royal commissions, which are legal inquiries into devastating events. And this, some would argue, has caused a lot of fear whenever somebody comes asking questions about a disaster. I think this was the first time that anyone has asked people questions about a disaster that didn't have the potential to find them at risk of losing their jobs. So that was quite powerful once we really convinced people that we were here in the spirit of learning and not in the spirit of assigning blame. The other benefit, I think, comes from looking across all the different PERC studies, and we can start to see where patterns emerge at a global level, where we did some meta-analysis of the flood PERCs and found really similar issues in Morocco and in Germany, in Switzerland and in Peru. And I think that really says something about what the challenges in the disaster space are. In terms of a drawback, some people have critiqued that meta-analysis and sort of pointed out that perhaps we're getting similar results because we have because the PERC has a similar, because all the PERCs have a similar structure. So we're following this structure. Now, I don't necessarily agree with that, but it is an interesting thought and something that we have to keep in mind is the structure of the PERC biasing us towards particular perspectives. Another challenge, I think, and this is the flip side of the independence, is that because the PERCs are not sponsored by government, the governments possibly have no obligation to pay attention and can more easily dismiss the findings. And finally, as with any investigation, it's dependent on the people you speak to, and there is a limit, as Michael said, to how many people you can talk to. So the findings are going to be biased depending on if you don't manage to reach certain groups, and that needs to be kept in mind, particularly if those groups are the most vulnerable and the ones that have the least voice. That's it. Thanks.
Great, thank you. We just got another question online, and I'm going to throw this open to anybody. Hearing the recommendations and findings from 3 different wildfires from 3 different parts of the world, which stands out as a common thread among the 3? Anybody?
It's Paul. I'll jump in first. I think a key finding that stands out to me is that we have considerable capacity to take control of this. It's the choices that we're making. We're choosing to live in vulnerable areas and not to take the right actions to be properly prepared as individual homeowners and as businesses and as society. Fire is something that's been around a long time, and we can live with fire. But there's just evidence showing up that we're not choosing to respect the risks associated with fire as should be done. And I think there's quite a bit of evidence that we're doing some things all right, but we should be doing it all really well. And that there's a lot of commonality, I think, internationally, that we're choosing to live at risk and not taking the right actions to respect that.
Thank you. Anybody else?
Yeah, I'm happy to add on to that. I think the topic of climate change obviously is inevitable when you talk about wildfires, and it's not just about talking about this, but I think you clearly see it evidence in the findings of the 3 reports quite independently. So I think the question is not just looking at the current situation, but this forward-looking approach is really important. Develop scenarios. What is the future world going to look like, and then how does this affect me in terms of wildfire? And not just wildfires. I think you see it for flooding, you see it for drought, you see it for other aspects of climate change as well. But that effectively, the past is the past, and this may be an indication, but not a full indication of the future. And really start looking at, what information do I need so I can really think about the future state and do risk reduction and integral protection about the future state, and not base this in past experience. There's a lot of talk about how the fire risk is increasing. Now, this may be a repetition for all of you, but I just wanted to stress that fire risk is composed of 3 elements that act quite independently. We have the fire hazard itself. Then we have exposure and we have vulnerability. And if we say fire risk is increasing, then this is not just due to the fire hazard increasing, but if we keep building more in the wild and urban interface, as mentioned specifically also by Rachel, if we have more vulnerable infrastructure and we're not quite sure how this reacts to the fire hazard, then clearly that's increasing the fire risk as well. So it's all 3 components that we need to take care in these future scenarios. Just a second aspect beyond the climate change that I've seen coming out of all of these studies is the indirect or the secondary and also tertiary consequences. So whether it was the oil price and kind of the almost financial ruin of the area that had a connection to the wildfire, whether it's actually possible to return on your development path that you had, or whether there's a very different look and feel of the community after a fire, I think that is a key question. In California, this indirect consequences were also around how do you repair infrastructure. I'm not sure, Rachel, you mentioned it, but I think it was a big surprise in terms of how you repair your water infrastructure that was affected by the fire. And there were a lot of negative surprises coming out of, the way this infrastructure is constructed, but also the rules and regulations, because nobody was foreseeing that type of scenario, that the contamination and hence the repair of the water infrastructure is not just at where the water treatment plant is, but actually in your plumbing and tubing throughout the community. So that was an unexpected indirect consequence of the fire. Whether it's fires triggering mudslides or flooding, that has a lot of additional impact. So I think that was clearly something we've seen throughout the three perils as well, and whether it's the wine industry and other examples that we've heard. And last, and this is an interesting one because it keeps coming back to us, not just in the wildfire PERCs, but throughout all the flood assessments that we've done as well. And that's the question of the role of cost and benefit analysis. Are we really looking fully into what benefits should we be counting, should we be monetizing to make this a better and kind of a more forward-looking cost-benefit analysis that also favors or at least fairly treats green infrastructure, ecosystem solutions that currently we're not so much looking at compared to physical infrastructure. And obviously also where are the costs? And I think that's also related to a question asked in the Q&A box earlier around, externalities, and are we treating everybody fairly in how they pay for their losses and for indirect losses. So we need to quantify costs beyond, I think, what we're currently doing. So those are some of the common trends that I see coming from these post-event reviews.
Thank you, Mike. Paul, I wanted to ask you a couple of quick things, and then I wanted to give it to Michael to end it off by 1:30. But Paul, very quickly, why did you choose to do this report using a Sendai lens and structure it the way Sendai is structured?
When I was in Sendai and the world community came together, there was a strong international agreement that this new science-based approach would help carry the world forward in the best way through 2030. There was a global consensus building science into how we understand hazards, things would work, and these four broad dimensions in terms of the priorities for action were just so universally agreed to as the right framing for work going forward, as a new framing. After Sendai, the government of Canada has endorsed it, the government of British Columbia has endorsed it, several communities have brought it forward as the Canadian approach as well as the international approach for dealing with this. We're going to increasingly build that into the work done at the Institute. If you've thought across those four broad questions, you have a real good sense where you are. Hopefully some opportunities for improvement, but also a sense what's going well. So I think this international framing works very well in hazards in Canada, risks in Canada going forward. And I think it was a strong international consensus about the right way to think about these hazards for the future. Thanks, Glenn.
Thanks, Paul. Okay, I'm going to just hand it over to Michael, and then we're going to end it up. But Michael, after a dozen or so flood reports, you did a couple of wildfire. So where does PERC go from here?
That's a very good question. Well, specifically, PERC goes to Mozambique, Malawi, and Zimbabwe next. That's the next that we have in the pipeline, looking at the consequences from hurricanes Kenneth and Idai. So that's the very specific next event that we're looking at. But I think in terms of, where the methodology is going, I really like what Adriana was saying in terms of, this being a good approach for open source learning in the disaster review manual that she mentioned. So I think if we can, get more partners interested in building up the library, making sure we use this learning open source, and really focus on the learning rather than on the recount of what happened. So I think what's still kind of burning in my eyes are some of the pages that I was reading from learning reports, or so-called learning reports from big flood events, where you have hundreds and hundreds of pages just recounting of what happened and how high the flood mark was and what type of damage ensued. And then maybe, you know, learning comes in, the real learning comes in just as an afterthought. So I think it's not so much describing how bad it was that will bring us forward, but really trying to understand what got it there and what we can do about it. And I think that's the power of the methodology. That has to be done open source and very transparently. And if we can all come together and do more of these and maybe spin out to further perils, whether it's earthquake or famine or whatever it may be, I think we can really build a big library and a big traction here. And I think all of your organizations supporting this so far and going forward are really invaluable in doing that. And for that, I really want to commend you and thank you.
Thank you, Michael. We can go on for another hour, I'm quite sure, but I think we're going to have to stop it there. I just want to thank, first of all, our attendees, and keep an eye on your inbox for the next Friday Forum webinar. I also want to thank Michael, Paul, Rachel, and Adriana for their contribution today. And I really would like to thank Tracy Cook. This was the most complicated webinar we've done so far. It went off seamlessly. It was a big load off of my mind, and I thank Tracy very much. These slides will be up on our website probably early next week, and a replay of this webinar will be on our YouTube channel also probably at some point early next week. So thank you once again, and let's call it a day. Take care, everybody.
Thanks, everybody. Thank you, Glenn.